Hello and welcome to a guided tour of my designs up to the point where I currently am at this, the 9th of October 2016, leading towards my mosquito project pistol. The first design I worked upon was the micro tube gun, as you can see up here. Very simple design. This was before I understood the actual limitations of my 3D printer and the material I was working with. Had this here, and this was originally designed with a 22 blank in mind just because that's what I could get. I hadn't found the percussion caps at that point, so I worked with what I had, which was a 22 nail gun blank. Of course, the plastic I was making this out of couldn't handle the pressure necessary to set the thing off, and the springs I had available couldn't actually create enough pressure to set it off anyway, so the whole thing was moot. If I had better materials to work with, it might have worked, but I just didn't. So basically what it had was this, and this would slide into these grooves here to lock in place. This would be the main tube containing the spring and the firing pin. And you would sit that all in here, firing pin here, and you would pull back the firing pin assembly to this point, lock it in, and then you would knock it sideways and it would fire forward. And this, of course, was the back bushing to hold the spring in and allow for the back of the firing pin to come out here, and I would have eventually had this mounted to something with a handle and all that to work, but obviously it failed completely, despite many attempts to actually make a version of it that would work. The materials are just not, the materials I have available are just not conducive to having that work at all. Then I moved on to this one, which was kind of an attempt to make the previous idea work with a tube, plumbing supply tube. Obviously, complete failure. It never got past this. It actually never got past this point, which was meant to be an insert for a different kind of tube, but again, the material just couldn't handle it, so complete failure. Then I moved on to this design, which was going to be a two-shot shotgun style Derringer that you could attach separate barrels or barrel liners to. It would hinge on this up here, have a locking pin down here to hold the whole thing together, and then you'd have a trigger system, a hammer system pivoting on this hole and sliding down this rail to set the cartridges off. But again, the material just wouldn't have been able to handle that, and it couldn't even properly print it, so I abandoned the project altogether at this point. I didn't even attempt to print these because the previous prints I had tried with other parts of it just failed utterly. One of those things that if you can make it out of the right kind of material and set it up with the right kind of spring, it might work, but I do not have the capacity currently to do that. So it's a failure for me entirely at this point. So then I moved on to this. This is a design. I had square steel tubing in mind when I designed this. Essentially, you would have the cartridge sitting in here. You'd have the barrel liner or tube, some kind of thing attached to the outside of this, and then you'd put a barrel liner inside this tube. And you'd have the spring inside this square tube chamber here, and it would lock onto this. This would be the firing pin. You'd have a backstop spring here, and it would slam into that, fire the thing, and then the backstop spring would recock it back into that, so you could easily swing this open, take the shell out, put a fresh one in, and then fire it again. Obviously, complete failure, again, due to the improper materials. I don't have the materials necessary to make that design work at all, so it's complete failure. I also worked on this, which was an adapter for an adapter for the shell for the next design that I attempted to make work, which would separate that all into a different setup here, and of course have the spring, the pivot thing here didn't need the backstop spring, so it would have it pivoting on here. You would have this thing attached to a spring, and you would flip that up and it would slam back into there and fire the thing and go like that. And I played around with the design for several of these. None of them worked because, again, the materials. Then I started thinking maybe I should make my own spring out of plastic, as the first 3D printable full firearm, the Liberator 2.0 or whatever it was called, had a 3D printed spring. Of course, I didn't realize at the time that it had to be ABS plastic. It had to have multiple coils. So I made several of these and they all snapped at one point or another. None of them came close to enough force to actually set anything off. Through several iterations of this very fancy looking sear and release system here, integrated spring and hammer system. I imagine if you made this out of spring steel, it might actually work. So if someone wants to do that, this file is up already on the Patreon page, so go right ahead and try it if you want to do it with better materials. And then of course I figured I'd go for a longer stroke spring, something like this. Refining this. Of course I'm still on the adapter based barrel system here, which was an interesting idea but never worked for me. And then I tried putting this bridge over here, better mounting surface, long stroke. Try to do this with a metal spring that would pin here and then arch over into this. again, total failure, unfortunately, or rather, quite fortunately, if depending on how you look at it. Then I moved on to this. My first attempt at well, it started off as another attempt at a spring-fired one, but it ended up being my first attempt at a tube-fired one, or a rubber-fired one. Call it the tube-fire thing because it was designed to be all, the entire operation was to take place in a tube. Obviously a complete failure. Basically you would load it into this portion, you'd have the rim out here, and you'd have the firing system back here, impacting it. The whole thing would take place in that tube, and the rest of the gun would just be trigger action. Yeah, like this. Exceptionally long design, but theoretically could have worked. You have the thing sitting in there, and you'd have a shroud across here. Fire it down there. Then I started working on designs for the hammer and the spring system. And about this right here was about the time I migrated to the idea of using rubber. This hammer here would be attached to rubber, would pivot on this point, it would attach to rubber here, and the rubber would go over all the way to the front here, and then that would slam into an embedded firing pin and set the round off. Scroll inside something here, yeah. And that whole setup there would also be rubbered to the front of it, but it wouldn't set anything off. The trigger and yoke system turned out to be almost impossible to print, and it was certainly never enough to actually, it was never sturdy enough to actually work. I decided to split up the frame into various pieces here. Side panel here, top panel here embedded to the actual barrel. This section here to hold one end of the rubber, which would loop around to the hammer, which would be cocked back and linked to one of these pieces here, and then the trigger would slide completely straight backwards and release the hammer and fire the gun. Unfortunately, of course, it just impractical, almost impossible to print. I came up with this one, called it the punch gun because of the way it would be actuated. The idea was you would basically it would work similarly to a shock stick that they use on sharks. You press forward on the actual front of the thing, and that would act as the trigger. That was doomed to failure, and it wouldn't be incredibly practical in a .22 caliber anyways, but you know, something I experimented with. You these handles and all that. This chamber, you'd have the whole thing tied to a spring system in the front, and the barrel would slide backwards. Kind of like my current design, but very flimsy by comparison. And again, highly impractical with a .22 caliber. Then I moved on to this, called it the kludge gun because of the way it fit together, sandwiched together between back panel pieces and side panel pieces. Like this eventually evolved into a single sandwich middle piece that everything else would interact with, and that each side panel would hold together, and it would sandwich the whole thing together like that. As you can see, it still tried to use a spring system. I went back to the spring idea before I abandoned it. And it would have this adapter, which contained a .22. By now, I had gotten hold of percussion caps, so I worked this into a percussion cap version, which unfortunately just wouldn't work, mostly because the plastic absorbed all the force you put into it, so it was never enough to set off a percussion cap. But yeah, basically this would be the hammer. It pivot on this point, press the spring down, and then you pull this trigger, and the yoke here would push this sear back and forward, and release the thing, fire the gun. Again, might work with better materials. Like if you could make all of this stuff out of steel, that might actually work, but I certainly do not have the tools or materials necessary for that to work. I worked in a more swept back version of it, kind of thing. Like a small rifle setup. Again, not with the materials I had available, never would have worked. This one was an intermediate. I was working kind of at the same time as the last one I showed you. Basically, it would have these two hammer pieces here. They would swing down, pivoting on this, and they'd have a piece of rubber attached to both of them. They would both fire at the same time. And I hadn't quite worked out how the trigger would work, but it would slide on a rail down here until it impacted this and released both of these hammers at the same time, and these hammers would fire a pair of .22 calibers in these really short barrels. This whole thing was designed to be held like a pair of brass knuckles. Again, the materials I don't have the materials to make that work. I am not confident that it would have worked at all, even if I had the right materials, so yeah. This one got abandoned very quickly. And by the time I named this one, another gun design, I had grown weary of this entire thing. But I came up with this system here, where it would be separated into sections and have this slide carrying a firing pin or a firing surface of some kind, and then have a captive pin in here that would fire a .22 sitting inside a chamber made of a long hex nut, which I I haven't abandoned that concept. I actually have a couple of those hex nuts chambered for 22 right now. I haven't actually managed to fire any. I haven't tried recently. But essentially this would slide back on rubber wrapped around these tabs here on this one, and then slide forward and fire the round through the tube that is built right into this. Then I figured maybe a hammer system would work better, have the thing contained entirely within that. That kind of worked. Not great, but it kind of worked. Coming up with a slightly better version of that, more powerful. Instead of having the slide move, I had the barrel move. I had the firing pin embedded in here. This design was the first one I came up with that actually fired independently on its own. And of course I moved on to this one. It's pinned together. I still have one of these that works. It doesn't have this swept back extra large tab. That one I tossed out because it was highly impractical, but I do have one of these frames still working with this frame and pin setup pinned to this little plastic piece here. It was highly uncomfortable, so I changed the... I'm inside something here. Yeah, it was highly impractical, so I changed it up to to add this to this, and add this to this to get this. And then of course I had this one, fleshed it out, added that heel there, the palm swell heel, and it's actually quite comfortable that way. That's what my most updated design is built on, this back end. I moved this back a little bit, this area here. I've removed this sweeping curve thing here, although I may have to replace it with something else. And I was still working on my short little percussion cap barrel combo here, with the firing pin all the way forward into this chamber. It wasn't until I got to this design that I decided to remove the big tabs and have the thing just extra deep back here and swept back. Yeah, this design took a lot of work to finish. Then I designed this one with the percussion cap and barrel combo farther back and loading from the top. So the firing pin could be shorter, and you didn't have the explosion. There's always a little bit of ephemera explosion going out sideways, so this meant it went up. I've changed the design since then. Moved this a little farther back, split the rail, made the trigger a little better. Added this because it's much easier to grip with your what you have is your index finger in here firing, you have your middle finger here holding onto the thing, and then you have the third finger down here to provide more support when you squeeze up against the back of this, because having it just like this without that meant you were squeezing way too far on this one. You couldn't get a good purchase on it, so it didn't have any support on the back. So I had to add that to it to make that work, and that was a tedious job. And then I figured out how to split it in two for the sake of for the sake of, what's it called there? Injection molding, because of this cavity here was very, very difficult to clean out after I printed it because it needed to put a support structure under there. So one side of it wouldn't end up drooping and molding right next to the other one. It was a pain to clean out. It almost would have been quicker to just let it mold in and fill it in after the fact, but that's not really practical for what do you call it? Injection molding. So I designed this with that and injection molding, and I had the screw holes here for Chicago style screws to hold the whole thing together. That one is inset. This one I couldn't find a way to inset it, nor this one up at the front, but it would have worked. It would have held the gun together quite nicely, just those three. And then I had this all together printed with this kind of ratcheted rail system for a sight picture. It works quite well, although this particular design didn't print well. And this channel here, setting it up like that, makes it a lot easier to make for injection molding, although not as easy to assemble because you got to have a metal rod pinned here and here for the trigger to interact with in this space. So that was a kind of a pain to assemble, put that together. I changed it slightly for the 22 because I'm still working on that kind of as a theory work. Didn't need it for that because I'm not intending to mass produce those. That's just my own little hobby there. Yeah, this one printed a lot cleaner. And then I moved on to the current design, which I'm not going to detail because I'm still working on it. I'm still hoping to patent it, but basically I swapped the rail. So the rail is on the sliding barrel mechanism, and the groove it sits in is in the frame. It makes it a lot easier to have the thing be low profile, vertically speaking. But it's more difficult to print. You have to print it upside down. This area here is a little weak. They've all cracked a little. I may have to make it just a little bit taller because of that. But we'll see how that goes. And of course I migrated the trigger rubber up here, so it loops in here and loops around the thing up here. But yeah, much more comfortable. It fires percussion caps all right, but it takes a bunch of tries, mostly because the way I have it set up, the center of this is a little high compared to the firing pin, which is good for the 22, but not very good for the percussion cap. So I may just have to take the firing pin out for the percussion cap and put a flat metal plate in this space to fire off the percussion cap. I've also changed it so that this has an opening in here for the extraneous explosion to go up, because it's kind of scorching the rubber. Doesn't have any direct path to go, so it just goes out all sides. I may have to add wings to this a little farther, a little outwards and a little farther forward, just to make sure it goes up instead of going out all sides. But yeah, that's about where I'm at now. Obviously this I've redesigned, but I'm not gonna give you my complete newest version of this in this video. Alright, that was a guided tour of my progress up to this point. I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for watching. Farewell.